First, I want to thank Paul for that very kind introduction and for his support of Georgetown. I think with the changes in the Big East this year, they're going to need it. Again, my name is Jeff McLynch. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. For those of you who were here last year, know that I tend to inundate folks with slides. I thought I'd dispense with that tonight, and so there are handouts going around so that you can take those home. Just to give you a little more background about our organization, we're a small nonprofit based in Concord. We're 3 people, myself, a policy analyst and a communications coordinator. And our mission is really to try to explore and promote public policies to foster economic opportunity for everyone, but in particular low and moderate income people here in New Hampshire. And so when we're not busy talking about constitutional amendments, we've also weighed in on issues like Medicaid, and just earlier today we released a paper that looked at what it might mean for New Hampshire if we were to expand Medicaid under the auspices of the Affordable Care Act, and it sort of lays out how many people might benefit, what the cost of the state might be, what some of the savings we could realize would be about that. And if you're interested, all of our information is available for free on our website, and that's nhfpi.org. We also hope in the coming weeks to release a similar report looking at some of the economic trends here in New Hampshire, particularly focused on income inequality. So as Paul said at the outset, the focus of my presentation this evening is on constitutional amendments that you'll face this fall. And obviously, when we talk about elections, we tend to focus on the top of the ticket: the president, the governor, senatorial races at the state house level, and state reps. And rightly so, the stakes there are quite high. But I think that this fall, voters will make some very important decisions on other issues as well. And that's because they are permanent in a sense. While folks that we elect this fall may serve 2, 3, 4, however many terms, if changes are put into the Constitution, they're tended to be permanent. And by and large they are, because it's very difficult to amend the Constitution. And so what I thought I'd spend a little bit of time with you tonight on is one of those amendments in particular. And in your handouts I provided, so just to give you some basic background, there will be 3 constitutional related questions on the ballot this fall. And Paul, I want to just correct one thing that you said. Just this past week, the order of the questions has been changed. So the first question will be related to an income tax. The second deals with the relationship between the courts and the legislature, and who has a say in setting internal court rules. And the third question relates to whether the state should call a constitutional convention. For those first 2 questions, those are actual amendments to the Constitution, and the requirement for those to get into the Constitution is that 2/3 of the voters have to approve them. And it's not just 2/3 of all voters, it's 2/3 of people voting on those questions. So if you are opposed to these questions, you definitely need to vote no. It's not enough to simply not answer the question. You must vote no. For the Constitutional Convention, it's simply a majority of the voters. And this is a relatively new feature of the New Hampshire Constitution, relatively new in constitutional terms being 1980. It's only since 1980 that, I should say, take that back a bit. The first 2 amendments come to us courtesy of a new procedure where the legislature can put forward amendments to the voters. Up until that time, it was only by constitutional convention that New Hampshire's Constitution could be amended. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on the second of the 2 questions related to the courts, but I did want to provide you with the language that's on page 3, along with an editorial from former Governor Merrill and former Justice Nadeau, laying out some of the arguments against this particular amendment, that is the courts, and really emphasizing that this really does some damage to the notion of an independent judiciary. And if there are folks who have views on that during the question and answer, we can certainly talk about those a little bit. But what I really wanted to focus on was what is now going to be question 1. Coming out of the legislature, you may have heard it referred to as CACR 13. And I've included the language here, and I hope you'll bear with me. I just want to read it to you. And so it asks, are you in favor of amending the second part of the Constitution by inserting after Article 5B a new article to read as follows? Notwithstanding any general or special provision of this Constitution, the General Court shall not have the power or authority to impose and levy any assessment, rate, or tax upon income earned by any natural person. However, nothing in this article shall be construed to prohibit any tax in effect on January 1, 2012, or adjustment to the rate of such tax. Sounds really simple, right? Well, it's anything but simple because of the structure of New Hampshire's Constitution, particularly in regards to taxes. The intent of this is clear, to prohibit New Hampshire from ever adopting what many other states and the federal government have, a broad-based income tax. The reason for this complex language is the way that amendment would potentially interact with other provisions in the Constitution. Take, for instance, this phrase, natural person. Sounds very wonky and legalistic, but it's necessary from a constitutional perspective because you need to distinguish in this case from natural persons, myself, everyone here in this room, your friends and families, and legal persons like corporations. Secondly, there's a clause here at the end, except any tax already in place. Well, that's because New Hampshire already does impose a tax on some forms of income, like interest and dividends, and if this wasn't here, it could potentially eliminate that very vital source of revenue. And so, while the intent may be clear, the necessity for this particular amendment, in our view, is anything but. From our perspective, this amendment is a solution in search of a problem. As many of you know, New Hampshire has not seriously considered an income tax in several years. The last real big push to have one was 1999 at least. And we have readily available, regularly used, and extremely effective tools for shaping policy outcomes here in New Hampshire, particularly on taxes. They're called elections and the legislative process. And obviously they do their job because we don't have an income tax right now here in New Hampshire. And if they didn't do their job, everyone here would be so concerned about what's going to happen in early November. So this is really just unnecessary in the broader scheme of things. But just because it's unnecessary doesn't mean that it wouldn't have consequences. First and foremost, it would tie the hands of our future legislators and, by extension, limit the choices available to our children and our grandchildren. We don't know the challenges they're going to face in the decades ahead. We don't know the opportunities that might be available to them. Nor do we know, and nor should we dictate to them, how they respond to those challenges and opportunities. CACR 13, or question 1, would do just that. It would take options off the table, and it would really limit the accountability of our elected officials in responding to changing circumstances. More directly, it would freeze in place our existing tax system. And while I don't think that this argument, that this debate about the constitutional amendment is really about the merits of the income tax or about the flaws of New Hampshire's tax system, it's really more about how we govern ourselves and the choices we make available to our elected officials. I do think that it has some bearing on it. And a couple things to consider are that New Hampshire's tax system as it stands today is certainly quite flawed. And that's what some of the slides in the handout try to illustrate. First and foremost, our tax system contributes to ongoing budget deficits, to ongoing budget struggles. We have what policy analysts like to refer to as a structural budget deficit. The revenues we produce with our tax system don't grow along with the economy or overall needs, and so it creates a constant struggle to try to keep up. And that's illustrated in one of the slides we have here, where personal income over the last 15, 20 years or so has grown by close to 2.5% per year. But if you look at general fund revenue, it's grown by less than 1%, closer to 0.5% per year. And so there's a real mismatch between trying to meet people's needs, whether it's through health and human services, through transportation investments, through education investments, and the tax system that we now have in place. The tax system we have in place now also suffers from another major flaw, and that is that it's regressive. It asks much more of low and moderate income people than it does of upper income ones. And just to put some specific numbers to that, if you look back to 2007, that's where this next graph on page 7 is from. People in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, the poorest folks in New Hampshire, paid an effective tax rate of just over 8%. And that's all taxes, state and local, so everything from the gas tax to your communication services tax you pay when you get your phone bill, to your local property tax and so forth. Contrast that with people at the very top of the income distribution. In 2007, these are folks at an average income of well over $1 million. I think it was about $1.6 million. Their effective tax rate was just about 2%. So 1/4. We ask much more of low and moderate income people when it comes relative to their incomes, when it comes to funding state and local services, than we do with the most affluent. And that's a system that would stay in place in perpetuity if CACR 13 were adopted. Another feature to consider is that we rely very heavily, as you might suspect, on property taxes to finance state and local services. We also tend to rely more heavily than most places on business taxes. And if something like question 1 becomes part of the Constitution, and we need to generate additional revenue, whether it's to ensure that our public universities are properly funded, whether it's to make sure that we have roads and bridges that actually don't result in wheels being taken off your car, the only places to look are going to be the places that are now in existence, and that means additional reliance on the property tax, additional reliance on business taxes. So really kind of exacerbating that reliance. And again, as much as this conversation isn't necessarily about the merits of an income tax, you are likely to hear claims in support of question 1 about the benefits of not having an income tax and sort of referencing other states. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that the presence of an income tax or the absence of an income tax doesn't guarantee fiscal security for the state. It doesn't ensure that you're on the path to fiscal doom, nor does it ensure economic prosperity or ensure hard times. And that's what these last 2 graphs really try to illustrate. If you look at the most recent fiscal year across the states, about 30 states face budget deficits, some of them quite substantial. And the relationship between the presence and their absence of an income tax and the occurrence of a budget deficit is really non-existent. If you look at this map here, you see states like Texas and Florida. They notoriously do not have an income tax, and yet they experience budget deficits. Similarly, states that lacked income taxes had pretty good fiscal outlooks, like Wyoming. So there's really a pretty varying relationship. Same is true of economic outcomes. It's when people talk about this issue, they tend to emphasize that we enjoy the so-called New Hampshire advantage because we lack a broad-based income or sales tax. But if you look back over the past decade and look at what states with income taxes and those without them have done, in the aggregate, the performance is pretty similar. Take, for instance, per capita gross state product growth. That's sort of a rough proxy for economic growth. If you look at the states that, and I should say these numbers come from a study that looked at potential income tax cuts in other states, but I think the findings still apply here. What you see is that in so-called high-rate income tax states, they had pretty robust gross state product growth, about 10% overall. Compare that with states lacking income taxes, slightly lower, 8%. And just to give you some specifics, in New Hampshire, that rate was 6.9%. That's better than a lot of places, but not as good as, say, for instance, Oregon, which was over 25%, or Wyoming. In Oregon's case, they have an income tax. Wyoming, they lack it. So there's really a very inconsistent relationship between the presence or absence of an income tax and sort of particularly desired outcomes. But really what I want to emphasize is that as much as I'm trying to give you information about fiscal policy here, it really comes down to the choices we want to leave available for our children and grandchildren and the elected officials that are going to serve them. If we put something like question 1 into the Constitution, it really takes options off the table and does so unnecessarily. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, tell you a little bit more about the Medicaid paper we put out today. If there are folks who want to talk about the court-related amendment, that might be an opportunity for that as well. Representative?
Hi, I'm going to make a speech about this on the floor, and one thing I pointed out is the only other state without either a sales or income tax is Alaska. and they have oil, of course, and believe it or not, Sarah Palin made sure that they have $12 billion in surplus reserve. And it's just insane that we would pass this and limit all our possibilities for future revenue.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One thing I did point out is that, Alaska is definitely an example, but most of the other states that lack an income tax have some form of other revenue that they use to compensate. In Alaska's case, it's oil. In the case of Wyoming and North Dakota, it's natural gas reserves. Nevada, gaming industry, obviously. So there are ways to compensate for that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, those people that support the idea of an income tax often suggest that if you institute an income tax, that the property tax will either be lowered or the rate of increase will be slowed.
Mm-hmm.
What can you say about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think one of the key things to think about is that, particularly in the context of this debate, is we don't know what an income tax would look like in New Hampshire. We don't know what the rate would be. We don't know what the exemptions or deductions would be. And most importantly, we don't know what it would be used for, whether it be used to finance education directly, whether it be used to reduce property or business taxes. So folks that argue about, well, we shouldn't have an income tax, they're really sort of pointing to a very undefined thing at this stage. Similarly, people who support it, we really don't know what the specifics are. To your point about whether it could be used to reduce property taxes, there are a number of states that have income taxes in place, and what they do to help mitigate property taxes is they include in their income tax credits of various kinds. In some cases, they're direct credits for the property tax you pay up to a certain limit, so that if your property tax bill is, say, $3,000 and the credit is written limited to $2,500, you just take that off of your income tax liability. There are other more targeted ways to do it. They're called circuit breakers that limit the amount of property tax you pay to a certain percentage of your income. The particulars on that vary from state to state, and sometimes they're available just to the elderly, sometimes they're available to all taxpayers, sometimes they're not available to renters, and sort of the percentage sort of cap on your income varies as well. It all comes down to sort of the trade-off of the revenue that gets lost in trying to provide that sort of relief. Yes, ma'am.
I'm very concerned that people are totally uninformed about this, or they don't read the paper, or nothing online. How do you suggest between now and then that we educate people so they can understand it when they see it on the ballot? They'll just think this is great, no taxes.
Sure. We, within the next week or so, hope to have a portion of our website that will sort of compile all the various news from various newspapers around the state. I'm also, in addition to appearing here tonight, going out around the state and talking on various access shows and so forth, and we'll try to provide that as well. The wording itself is available on the Secretary of State's website. I believe an organization we work with, Granite State Progress, also has information on its website. So those are some of the resources that might be available. But please feel free to share these documents with folks in your neighborhood.
And even something as simple, putting a flyer in your bank statement and your electric bill so everybody sees this. I suppose it has to be a nonpartisan discussion, but at least they would be educated about it.
Right, and I think that there is right now very low awareness of these constitutional amendments. Yes, sir.
I have 2 points. One is, in the pie chart, you list all of the sources for New Hampshire taxes at roughly 49%. Does that include what one might call federal welfare to us and payments to us, or is that some other?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question. You said
The
that.
pie chart says we get about half of our total revenue from other sources.
Yeah.
Can you give me an idea of the big
Yeah,
ones?
this is only from within the state sources, so federal revenue
Okay.
is not included here.
And the second point to be made is, this kind of constitutional amendment has failed in the past, probably mostly because of the hurdle of 65%. And that might be maybe fortunate enough to do that again. But in my view, the Constitutional Convention is a confusing beast, because that's another way of doing exactly this. What's the, and then you buried in a whole bunch of other changes which might be perceived as good. So I think both amendments, all three amendments, but at least there were two.
Sure.
amendments.
Yeah, and I should be clear that my understanding of the process is that any proposed amendment that is put forward by the convention then has to go to the voters in the same way that these other constitutional amendments. So it has to come out of the convention and then again receive 2/3 support.
Sure, but then it's a much more complex issue.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
If this fails, do you think that maybe it would be an opening for people to raise a pledge?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that it is, and I'll tell you why, or why I think that. If you look at the polling that's been done in recent months about the income tax generally and about this particular question, the people's sentiment has not generally shifted about the desirability or their interest in an income or sales tax. It's still north of 60–65%. But when you ask people, do you want question 1 put into the Constitution? The latest polls that we've seen, people support is in the roughly 40–45% range. Opposition is in the roughly 40–45% range, with 20–10% undecided. And I think that really comes down to what I try to emphasize about people's feelings about the Constitution. Our perspective is that there ought to be a clear and demonstrated need for amending the Constitution, and I think people understand that that standard is not met here. So regardless of their views about the income tax, they may have a different set of views about changes to the Constitution. Yes, sir.
Could this affect the state's credit rating?
I don't know. I mean, right now, I'm not a bond rating agency, so I can't speak authoritatively on it, but I guess I would say that right now, people's principal concern when bond rating agencies put forward their ratings is whether the state can make good on its current obligations. And the state makes good on its current obligations without an income tax. That said, we do have this structural deficit. And as that gets worse and worse, you need to think about ways that that's going to get resolved. I know that there have been debates in other states that have income taxes in place, and when proposals have been put forward to eliminate them, for instance in Oklahoma this past year, credit rating agencies have responded negatively because they see that there are outstanding obligations, or at least ongoing obligations in terms of public services, and if you take the major or one of the major sources of revenue out of the equation, that's going to affect their credit rating. Representative?
Just another point I might make about, not having an income tax is there's no infrastructure to give rebates to people perhaps that are paying too much. Like my sister in New Jersey got a rebate because her ratio of income to property tax was high, so she got a rebate. But we don't have that information, so we can't. And there have been many bills that have tried to do that in some way, but then you have to create, for instance, the statewide property tax. If that were administered from the DRA, then you could send rebates on that to certain property taxpayers who had low income and high property taxes, but we have no infrastructure to do that. It would cost about $15 million just to set that up.
We're going to let Jeff take 2 more questions.
What's the process by which these get on the ballot?
So they need to be approved by supermajorities in both the House and the Senate. They need to pass by a 3/5 vote. And what I mentioned background, I should have mentioned that there were, I think, close to 24 constitutional amendments considered in the legislature this year, some of which would have been as harmful as these. They would have limited the rate of growth of spending to just the rate of inflation, for instance. Those have not made it out of the legislature.
I'm really glad that you included CACR 26 in your information as well, because that is a really scary amendment to me, particularly because the first 6 lines of the section that they're adding are perfectly reasonable, and many people won't read further than that. But to give the legislature the right to control what the court does and how it conducts its business is entirely out of line with separation of powers and is a scary thing, and I hope that that doesn't pass.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.